If you've got your Bibles, we're in Matthew's Gospel again, still working through the Sermon on the Mount, and we're now reached chapter 7. So we're at the beginning of chapter 7. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way as you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, and then turn and tear you to pieces. This opening verse is probably one of the best known verses in the Bible among people who very seldom read it. Judge not that you be not judged. Have you ever heard that quoted? Even by people who don't make a habit of reading the Bible. It's quite a common one. It's quite popular. Often it's a very clear case of people lifting a verse out of its context to mean something different from what it actually means in its context. Usually if somebody says to you, "Judge not that you be not judged," what they're saying is, "Don't you criticize me. How dare you suggest that your ideas are better than mine? How dare you suggest that there's something wrong with me?" And there's a sort of a natural resistance to being criticized by someone else. Actually, this verse comes after we've been looking at Jesus' teaching on our personal life and morality and choices, and our personal spiritual life, our personal financial affairs. This verse, he's now moving into the realm of interpersonal relationships with people we meet on a daily basis. And remember also, when you're reading the Sermon on the Mount, these words are addressed to his disciples. It's to people who have gathered to hear what Jesus has to say, people who, many of whom are already committed to following him, others who are thinking, "I'm drawn to this guy, I want to know more." So he is actually addressing people who want to be followers of him. And that's quite important, especially bearing in mind the last bit we just read. So he's speaking to his disciples, he's speaking about interpersonal relationships here, and he makes a very, very clear prohibition: judge not, or you will be judged. As I say, it's often taken somewhat out of context, so I'm going to start by saying what he does not mean. He is not saying that when you become a Christian, you have to put aside all your moral judgment and discernment and understanding and just tolerate everything. That's a very popular thing in our present society. But he is not saying anything goes. He's not saying that we must never use our moral judgment or exercise our discernment and actually become rather silly. He's not saying that there's no place for critical assessment of people's values and ideas and standards and behaviour. That actually there's no such thing as an absolute standard of right and wrong. He is not saying that. He's not saying that we should never challenge anybody or evaluate their behaviour in the light of what God says is right or wrong. And to quote somebody I heard speaking some time ago, it is true that Christians are called to unconditional love, but that does not mean they are called to unconditional approval. And we need to have that very clear in our minds. It doesn't mean that we condone anything and everything just because somebody else thinks it's okay. So what does he mean? What is it that he's prohibiting here? If he's not saying cease to be moral beings with any sense of values to think about, I think it would be helpful if we take the word judgment and add something onto it. What he's saying is, do not be judgmental. Judgmentalism is a quite different thing from constructive criticism. I think we all know that, don't we? Usually we'd like to think that if we're receiving constructive criticism, that's just somebody being judgmental. But of course, when I say something to you, that's constructive criticism. And we'll come to double standards a little later in the passage. But we all know there is a difference. And what Jesus is saying is, do not become people who are constantly on the lookout for something to criticize, constantly focusing on people's faults. In fact, the key thing, the difference between constructive criticism and judgmentalism is actually the motive behind it. Oh, how often have we come across this as we've gone through the Sermon on the Mount? It's not just the words or the action. The key thing is, what is motivating that? And when we think we can sit in judgment on somebody else and condemn them, we are actually taking to ourselves something which is God's sole prerogative. Only He can judge. And furthermore, Jesus tells us that the Father himself actually judges no one. He says he has committed all judgment to the Son. So when eventually everybody has to give their account, and everybody does have to give their account, as I've said many times before, saying you don't believe in the judge doesn't mean that when you're standing in court he has no authority over you. So yeah, when we do have to give our account, it will actually be to Jesus that we have to give it. Because he is the one person who is qualified to be the judge of the motives of people's hearts. So, if I say what he's forbidding is the condemning of people rather than assessing behaviour and beliefs and opinions. And of course that is very destructive. Because the aim of criticising in order to condemn is just that. It's to condemn. It's not to build somebody up. It's not to help them to improve. It's to put them down so I can feel better about my attitude. And that's where we come to that next verse. Or you too will be judged. Before we start judging others, we need to be very aware that we also are accountable to the judge. And we need to be very aware of our own frailty and mindful that actually, depending on what standard the judge is applying, the outcome could be very different. And there is a warning there. For the measure with the way you judge others is the way you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Remember, there was a warning a little earlier in our script, back in chapter 6 and verse 14. We were warned, if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. That's a very clear warning. How much forgiveness you receive will actually have an impact on how much you give. Because it's like the stream that flows into the lake and out the other end. If the forgiveness is flowing in and through and is then shared out the other end, you've got a lovely clear stream. If you don't let it flow out the other end, then it becomes like the Dead Sea, which is so salty that nothing can live in it. And the reason for that is because there is no outlet. So, one of the key things in what Jesus is saying here is that he's not saying don't use your judgment, but only judge others by the standard you yourself are prepared and willing to be judged by. In fact, it's foreshadowing a verse that I think is probably going to crop up in Johnson's sermon next week. In everything you do to others, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. So basically, how would you want other people to judge you? Well, do it that way for them. How would you like them when they're assessing you or judging you and your opinions and your behaviour and your hang-ups and the way that your baggage makes you behave sometimes? How do you want to be judged? What is it that Jesus is condemning when he talks about judgmentalism? Would you want people, when they see you, to really seek out and focus on your faults rather than anything positive about you? Is that what you want them to focus on? Because that's what judging them in the wrong sense means. Would you like people to be really ready to believe the worst about you? Especially, because we are sometimes we're very ready to believe the worst we hear about people, especially if it's somebody we don't like very much, or perhaps somebody we feel rather jealous of, or perhaps somebody who in some way seems to trigger our baggage. And we'll come a little more of that later. We're actually quite ready to believe that person is rubbish. I don't need to listen to them because that person is not worth hearing. They're just prejudiced. They're just a nasty bully. They're just somebody who's had all the privileges that I've been denied, and so they can't judge me. And can you hear the motive of that? The desire is to excuse myself by focusing on their faults. And so, I'm ready to believe the worst about them because then I don't have to listen to what they might legitimately have to say to me. Would you like people to make assumptions about the inner motives of your heart when actually they don't really know you that well? Only God can judge the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Even our closest friends don't really know everything about what motivates us. But how often are people ready to assume they know all the facts about somebody when they've only heard one side of the story? If you think of, events that lead to people being charged with criminal offences, would you want to be standing before a jury that had heard everything your accuser had to say about you, but never got to hear what you had to say, or what other people who were there had to say? Would you like to be judged according simply to the person who accused you because nobody ever heard the other side of the story? Well, that would be very unjust, wouldn't it? It's one of the cardinal principles of our law system, is that a person is innocent until proved guilty. So people who sort of rush to judgment before they actually know all the facts are being distinctly unfair, and I doubt they would like the same thing to happen to them. Or are we very quick to condemn people for their worst moments and actions? I was once at a funeral for a prisoner from Whitemoor, and the chaplain was taking the funeral, And it was one thing he said. He said, actually, because this guy had become a Christian, you see, and so there was a whole other side to his story. He says, how many of us, he said, would like to be forever judged and assessed according to the worst thing we ever did? I think for all of us, what's the worst thing you've ever done? What's the thing you're most ashamed of? Would you want your whole life summed up on the basis of that? That's judgmentalism. And so when Jesus says, the measure you use is the measure you will be judged by, what he's saying is that when it comes to passing judgment, we need to take our cue from Jesus. You know, when he was faced with the woman caught in adultery, what he said to the accusers was, well, can the person who's without sin throw the first stone? And they all kind of crept away at that point. And the one person standing there who would have been qualified to throw the first stone didn't. He didn't condone what she'd done, but he actually gave her forgiveness and grace and the encouragement to rebuild. And that's the key in our relationships with others. That should be our motive, not to condemn, but to bring grace and mercy and encouragement to be different. That's the measure I want to be judged by. I don't really want anybody to know about the worst things I've ever done. I certainly don't want them to decide my future on the basis of them. But like Jesus, he is not condoning sin, but the grace he gives is absolutely phenomenal. And without it, not one of us here would have a hope. And we are presumably here because we've come through that grace door and we know how unworthy we are and we're overwhelmed with gratitude to Jesus and we want to become his followers and become like him. And I need to be ready to assume that the same is true of all the rest of you. It is true of me. I'm assuming that all the rest of you have that same desire, that same motive. You may not be there yet, I'm not either. But that's what is motivating us. And I assume that's the same for you. I've said it to an awful lot of people an awful lot of times. The average Christian does not wake up in the morning and think, who can I hurt and upset today? And yet all of us are sometimes guilty of hurting and upsetting people. Well, if I want people to understand that I didn't actually set out deliberately wanting to do that, I need to give them the grace of assuming that they probably didn't set out thinking, what can I do to hurt Fiona today either? So, in a sense, it's not that Jesus is saying you're never to judge in the proper sense. He's showing us how to use our judgment in a good way and a positive way. And this is where the humorous illustration comes in. Your brother's got a speck in his eye. Here, let me help you take it out. I can see a little speck in there, Shirley. Can I help you get it out? Now, actually, I'm a bit unaware of something, and it's an absolutely stupid, ridiculous picture. Jesus is using a ridiculous picture that people will laugh at to make the point. Now, actually, if it was me in this position, I'm in a worse position than even some of the rest of you, because I can't get my glasses on, which means the other eye's no good either. We're back to this bit about double standards. That's what hypocrisy is. It's when I've got a double standard. There's one standard which is for me, and there's one standard for everybody else. And so the first thing, if we're going to be judging rightly, is to deal with our own stuff first. to recognize that sometimes the reason I notice somebody else's fault is because it's triggering something in me. Maybe I'm recognizing something I'd rather not have to admit to myself. Or maybe they remind me of somebody who hurt me once and they're triggering me, and so I'm reacting unjustly to them because it's triggering up my baggage. So first, before we judge anyone, we need to check our own hearts, our own motives, and say, is my own stuff clouding my judgment here? What's motivating me? And so the first warning sign is to think, is there a plank in my own eye? Maybe that speck I can see is just the reflection of my own plank. But I'll tell you one thing, we are meant to help each other get the specks out of our eyes. But if I try to get near to you and take a speck out of your eye with this thing, what's going to happen? You're going to get whacked with my plank. Won't do. That's the first key. But if we're going to judge properly in our relationships, then there are various other things we need to take into account as well. First of all, we've got to be honest and truthful. It's about having a commitment to what God says. It's not about my feelings, my preferences, my opinions, and getting you to conform to them. But where the standard is clear and God's word is clear, then sin is sin is sin. There's no other word for it. And truth is true, and it will be even if you don't believe it. And what is good is good is good, and will remain so even if people don't like it. So first of all, before we start judging anyone, we need to be sure that we're actually on solid ground, that there actually is a speck in their eye. Because God says, actually, Gregory's got a bit of a speck there. Could you go and help him deal with it? Then I deal with my own baggage first, before going to dump on poor old Greg's. And I need to be humble enough to acknowledge my own frailty, that I've received grace and mercy. So actually, if I'm judging him because he's hurt my feelings, I need to extend forgiveness and grace first, before I go and speak to him. The bit about confronting your brother when you're offended is not so you can go and dump your anger all over him. It's so that you can be reconciled. That is the aim of a confrontation. It is to be reconciled. So first, you've got to dump your own stuff and not dump it on them. And then the aim is to build him up or her up. We're all aiming to become more like Jesus, to become more mature in our character. And we have a mutual accountability there. And I want to encourage all of you to follow Jesus more closely, to love him more, to be more like him. And I want you to encourage me the same way, because that's what it's all about. And so there, using the right judgment is actually blessing someone else. And we need an honest commitment to each other's spiritual welfare. And as I say, if you doubt that I'm picking this and putting it in its context, you only have to read an awful lot of other texts in the New Testament, both things that Jesus said, Paul says, Peter says, John says, everybody says, which will make it very clear that actually we do have a responsibility to build each other up and to challenge each other and to help each other grow. That is a precious gift given to the people of God. But there is another caveat in this passage. That's the last bit. Don't give what is holy to dogs, and don't cast your pearls before swine. Dogs and pigs. Now, if you know anything about first century Jewish society, you will know that pigs are unclean animals, and dogs, who are scavenging creatures, not pretty little pets like like little Molly that comes in here. It is a term used for the Gentiles. In other words, it's a term used for people who are not disciples, not God's people. They're kind of outside in that sense. Now, what does he mean? We know that the gospel is for everybody. So we're no longer in the situation as the Jews were then, where, the Gentiles are just outside, so you don't go to them. In fact, Jesus and Paul really encourage us to preach the gospel to outsiders. So what does he mean? Don't cast pearls before swine. Well, I think there's a big key. If you look in the book of Proverbs, chapter 9 and verses 8 to 9, there's a wise maxim here. Do not rebuke a mocker, or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. One of the things that distinguishes the wise man from the fool is a teachable spirit and a willingness to learn and an openness to correction. The fool doesn't like that. So here we're getting a little hint of what to do with people who aren't currently seeking to be disciples of Jesus. Now, it's not saying, well, just condone everything and tell them, yeah, that's fine for you, go ahead. But what he is saying, to use another old phrase that we use in this country a lot, you might as well save your breath to cool your porridge, because if somebody's not asking for advice, they're not going to listen to it. So if actually we're talking about people who are completely hardened against hearing what God has to say for whatever reason, they've maybe heard the gospel, you've pleaded with them, you've told them, they know the whole thing, they know where you're coming from, but they've said, no, I do not want that. What he's saying is, don't keep banging your head on a brick wall. You won't get anywhere. In fact, you may even find that it'll cause them to hate you and oppose you and harm you in some way. So don't keep preaching to the unwilling to be converted. But what about our concern for them? What about if that's somebody you love dearly? And they've said, don't talk to me about Jesus. I don't want to hear. I don't want to know. Be quiet. Or the friend who says, I'm not going to be your friend if you're going to keep banging on about religion all the time. Well, I think we take Jesus' advice. Don't keep throwing those pearls of love and care for them to deal with. Sometimes there comes a point where rather than endlessly talking to them about God, we just need to spend more time talking to God about them and allow him to do his work. Only he can soften a hard heart. Only he can change a person. Only he knows the secrets of men's hearts and the secret access point, the vulnerable spot that we don't even know about because the front they've put up is so impregnable. Doesn't mean we stop caring, but it may mean we have to take a different attitude. If you're my brother or my sister and I love you and I see you doing something that will be harmful for you, I have a duty to say, hey, have you thought what you're doing here? If you're not willing to hear, then I'm going to pray for you and allow God to work in you. And let's face it, there have been many who started out like those pigs and dogs and hardened hearts, who didn't end up that way. Paul himself is the prime example. So we don't give up hope, but we don't keep banging our heads on a brick wall. We take a more constructive approach. So, judge not, that you be not judged. But use your judgment wisely to build up your brothers and sisters and to face the things that may be triggered in me that I need the Lord to deal with.